Good morning.
Good
Hello.
morning.
Morning.
Good early morning, Danica.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Vlogs. Good afternoon. I think, I don't know if there was, oh, yeah, some people still getting connected. Let's wait for one more minute.
Good morning, everybody.
Hello, good afternoon.
Morning.
Mm. 30 more seconds. Okay, well, I think we can start. First of all, I'd like to thank you again for being here today. Some of you made a great effort. So I appreciate it particularly. Well, we have finished our first phase. I think there's someone coming in. In the meantime, Georgi has arrived. Hello, Georgi. Welcome. So,
hello, good morning.
Hello. So, as I was about to say, well, we have finished the first phase of our activity, and well, we got some conclusions on around what are the critical elements for what we could consider a good rural proofing scheme, and even I tried to develop a sort of questionnaire, trying to well, invite you to play with it a little bit and to try to answer it according to what you know of your own country or region or any other rural proofing system that you may be acquainted of. So but the most important thing now is to focus departing from that overall perspective of optimal, theoretically optimal rural proofing, to focus on certain case studies, and particularly on the way in these case studies monitoring and evaluation is carried out, if any, because sometimes it's easier to write or to say than to carry out. So we will first focus on the case of the islands of Scotland. I must say that I was very much pleased to see the quality of the materials that you can find on the internet, and also the ones that provided by Kate and Jane on this particular case. I find it to be a very clear-cut, net scheme organization, very much affordable or understandable, sorry, by anyone. But I would like them to comment on that case and answer to our questions on how they have organized it, how it is carried out, what are the main strengths they could tell us about, what are the main weaknesses, if any. I think there are always some weak points, and also to comment on how monitoring and evaluation is made. I would like to strengthen, to underpin a little bit that when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, we are referring to the very process of rural proofing. That means it is evaluated or can be assessed against the methodology, the guidance, the template, all these methodological tools that we should be using to rural proof, and not against, let's say, the overall strategy for fighting the population or improving living conditions and so on. This is something that has to be monitored and evaluated, but from the perspective of the very strategy. So we are not now just focusing on one of the tools of any strategy for rural policies, which is rural proofing, and the way it is carried out, and if we are doing the things we said we were due to make sure that there is a rural lens, that there is a rural consideration in whenever we design policies and strategies and legislation, and of course evaluation of what has come out of that effort. To me, evaluation would mean if we have finally generated that rural intelligence in our decision making process, in our decision makers. So I will give the floor to any of our Scottish friends. I don't know if Kate or Jane will start telling us about what they're doing.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, magic, thank you. All right, okay, so I'm sort of representing Scottish Government on this one, and Miguel had asked me to talk a bit about what we're doing in rural proofing in Scotland, with a focus on the monitoring and evaluation of that, which is not quite as straightforward as it might be, because in Scotland we have two different products or tools to do this with, one of which my team works on, the other is run by my islands colleagues. So I've asked them for some kind of information that I'm going to present to you today. I should be able to answer most questions you might have, but if at the end of this we get to questions that I cannot answer, I'm very happy to take them away to the colleague that knows more about it and come back to you. So the two different approaches that we have, the first one is the Island Communities Impact Assessment. We refer to it as the ICIA. That is a statutory requirement that is set out in our legislation. So it is mandatory for all of our policy teams, and over and above that, 70 other public bodies in Scotland to complete. And when they're supposed to do that is if they have new policy or updated policy or strategy or service where they think there will be a significantly different effect for an island community versus other communities. And it doesn't matter whether that other community is on the mainland or is a different island. If they have a scenario in which being on an island makes the impact different, they must complete an ICIA. One of the key purposes of that is to make sure that Scottish ministers have due regard to island communities when they're doing their decision making. They've all to impact the nuts and bolts of that, and the documents for the ICIA are publicly available on the Scottish Government website, so you can go and take a look at them. The other approach that we have is the Rural Assessment Toolkit. That is really very new. It was published internally for use just last week, so it's only just come out. Unlike the ICIA, the toolkit is completely voluntary. Nobody has to do it, and it is purely meant to be an internal tool for our policy teams, with a particular focus on the mainland rural Scotland, because obviously islands are more covered by the ICIA. And because it's not a public tool, we haven't published it on the Scottish Government website, but we're very happy to share it with people who might be particularly interested. So the guidance and the questionnaire I've provided to the group organisers for this group. So I think they may have already made it available to you, but it's entirely there for you to look at if you're interested. So those are our kind of two different approaches, one being mandatory, one not, but they both follow essentially the same format. They have guidance to help people move through them, and then a series of steps that they must work through. I think there's 5 for the toolkit and 7 for the ICIA. And those steps move the users through thinking about what their policy aims are, and how that relates to rural areas, thinking about what the rural context is in their policy area, what are the kind of factors that will impact it. It helps them engage really effectively with rural stakeholders who have an interest, and then taking that kind of group of knowledge to go back to their policy and start assessing and adapting it as necessary to make sure that what they're delivering takes into account rural needs properly. And then for both, the final steps are about monitoring and evaluating the results of that. So that's a kind of a broad overview. In a bit more detail for kind of how we've built the ICIA, it became mandatory through legislation that came out in 2018. So in 2019, Scotland's Rural College did a piece of work, research for us, that helped inform what we asked people to do when we were asking them for the ICIAs. They looked at international work, I think from England, Northern Ireland, Canada and New Zealand, and took learning from those countries. And they also looked at 4 really early ICIA case studies, where the very first ones that had been done to see what came back out of them and what we could learn. Those early case studies were really, really broad and different. They covered motorsports on public roads. They looked at social security system, planning, and fuel poverty. So lots of different topics. And what they found in terms of the ICIA reports was that there was a lot of variability. How long the reports were, the format they were in, the types of engagement that had been done, the understanding of the range of differential impacts that they were looking at. All of those were quite different. But interestingly, none of those policy teams had considered the variability between different islands. It sounds like they were very focused on islands as a homogenous whole and didn't recognise that there would always be a difference between, say, a large island like Orkney and one of the very small ones that has maybe 2 families that live on it. So that kind of differentiation was important. Coming out of that research, some of the kind of recommendations that they made were that we needed to have really strong guidance about how to complete one, how to move through it, really good templates so that when people were working on an ICIA or reporting on them, the templates were there for them to use, and the importance of maintaining an accurate and up-to-date evidence base that we could use for our ongoing work. So all of those recommendations got folded into the process of the ICIAs that we have today. So thinking about what they look like now, I'd mentioned that one of the key kind of purposes of the ICIA is making sure that ministers have a due regard to their island needs. It's not just ministers that we want to do that with. There are 70 other public bodies that are required to complete an ICIA. Those include island local authorities. And the point of that is that when decisions are being made right across our public sector, all of those bodies have the needs of islands in mind. So it's not just about government decision-making that matters, centralised government decision-making. It's all of those public bodies have to have that kind of perspective in mind. When they do ICIAs, they are having to do them when there is a differential impact. So if their policy is going to have a different impact on an island than it would elsewhere, that's when they do it. But importantly, if a policy team finds a piece of work and they think there will be no difference here, whether I implement this on an island or the mainland or whichever island I do it, there won't be any difference. If that's the decision they take, they still must publish online that decision so that there is transparency in this process. So that makes sure that island communities will understand when and how they've been considered in decision making. And also there may be occasions where it's not possible to make certain adjustments to a policy area. They'll be able to understand how and why that's the case. If we find that there are communities who disagree with an ICIA that's been completed, they may not think it's thorough enough or it's not accurate, or even if they disagree with the decision not to do one at all, there are review mechanisms. But to date, we haven't had any review requests received for that. So I suspect that doesn't happen terribly often, obviously. And in terms of monitoring this process that we have going, there are a vast number of ICIAs that are done every year. As you can imagine, if there is any kind of differential impact with every decision and strategy and policy, there's a lot there to get through. Relevant authorities are required to publish their ICIAs at least annually online on our government website, so they're very publicly available. They can do it more often if they want, but annually is the bare minimum of what they should be doing with that. And then in turn, all of those kind of reports are collated together and reported to our government ministers via the annual National Islands Plan report. So there's this kind of reporting process that goes right up the chain to our ministers. But in terms of evaluation, it is a priority for when funding allows, but currently it's not taking place. Although I'm told that there's a new National Islands Plan being drafted just now, and it should be published by the end of this year. I've been told that that may well be included as a commitment in that. So we're not doing it yet, but that doesn't mean that it's not very much in the forefront of our minds that we really should be doing it. So that's the kind of statutory version. The Rural Assessment Toolkit, which is the one that my team works on, is the voluntary version of that. In its origins, it's a bit different. Obviously, it doesn't come from legislation. But several years ago, the Scottish Government published an economic strategy which didn't fully take into account the rural aspects and rural economy in its thinking. And that was quite a kind of stark absence, if you like. So our ministers had asked our team to create a kind of a tool or a resource for economy policy teams to think about rural aspects of the rural economy and feed that into decision making. But not long after that, my team was also asked to work on the Rural Delivery Plan, which thinks about mainstreaming rural needs into all of Scottish Government policy and thinking about rural proofing generally. And at that point, we thought, if we've got this tool that could be used for economy teams, we should widen that out and have it relevant for all policy teams who might have an interest in the rural aspects of their work. So it's now this kind of broader tool that is for everyone working within Scottish Government. It is meant to be focused entirely on the mainland because obviously the ICIA focuses on islands, which is not to say there's not significant overlap there, but officially it is a mainland resource. I think there's a number of positives from having watched the development of this toolkit to its publication now. One of them is the strong way that it was developed in partnership. the rural stakeholder group that I work with on a quarterly basis provided an enormous amount of input from all different sectors into what that should look like. We also had a lot of international good practice learning to draw on, both from the Scotland's Rural College research from 2019, but more recent similar reports done by my analytical colleagues looking at what's out now. We also tested it iteratively with a number of policy teams who were starting to develop policy, and we'd said, could you start using this as if it had been published and see how you feel it goes? And so we got a lot of really helpful feedback from them about what was accessible about it, how the structure could be improved and things like that. And because of its links with the Rural Delivery Plan and other pieces of work like the ICIA, there's a lot of political awareness from ministers about it and political support, which I think is really important. So it is very positive in that sense, but as Miguel hinted at, there are weaknesses in there. One of the principal ones for me is that it is not a statutory tool. It is one voluntary possibility for policy teams to work from among a much wider context of a lot of statutory impact assessments that my colleagues have to do. There are statutory impact assessments about children and business and environment and all sorts. And when they have to do so many impact assessments, adding something else on rural is a big ask. And I suspect that as a voluntary tool, it will not get very much take up, or not nearly as much as we would like, because of that kind of maxing out of my colleagues' capacity. It's also, for this discussion, unfortunate that it's so new, because we don't have a clear sense of how or when or by whom it's being used yet, because it's only been out for a week. So in about 6 months, I think this could have been a really useful discussion where I could have talked a bit more about that. Because it's a voluntary tool, it's not required to be published, so teams can engage with the toolkit, work their way through it, but they don't have to publish anything about it if they don't want to. I mean, they could, but they don't have to. And we particularly didn't want to, we asked for that to be, for people not to publish it, because we didn't want to overload colleagues with additional burdens, particularly when they're publishing on the ICIA. But in terms of monitoring, we have asked at a number of different stages within the documents for teams voluntarily to get in touch with my team when they're using the toolkit, both so that we can provide kind of one-to-one support for them as they move through it and get the most out of it, but also so that we can store their completed questionnaires and pick up feedback, and that will help us kind of iteratively improve the toolkit as a resource for colleagues. We also have the toolkit both on our government intranet and also as an online learning module that colleagues can use. So we're collecting website information on the numbers of people accessing it and the click-throughs and all of that kind of thing to try and understand how it's getting used. An oversight of that, all of that data is coming to my team, and then much like my colleagues working on the ICIA, we'll be annually reporting up to ministers as part of wider work on the Rural Delivery Plan, and also reporting to the Rural Stakeholder Group who helped guide the development of the toolkit itself. So there's quite a lot of reporting happening there. But again, like my ICIA colleagues, we're not evaluating yet. Partly that's because we suspect the take-up is going to be quite low. We want to be quite proportionate about what we're doing. So we don't want to set aside a lot of kind of time and funding and resource for evaluating something that's, relatively speaking, quite small and meant to be quite light touch. But that doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the gap there in terms of understanding the impact that the toolkit might be having. So my overall thoughts in terms of monitoring and evaluation on what's happening in Scotland is that, particularly for the monitoring side, I'm aware that the effort that is going in both to use either the ICIA or the toolkit and then report back on its use is very much down to individual teams and authorities. Obviously, the ICIA people have to do it, but how much engagement they have and how much kind of energy and thought they put into that process, there is a lot of kind of wiggle room. Some people could really engage and get a lot out of it. others maybe less so. So there is that kind of potential gap there where, particularly for colleagues who feel very constrained in the amount of time they've got, they might treat it more like a checkbox exercise, which is a concern. I've been thinking about how we might get around that, because obviously we could start trying to kind of go around to colleagues as they're developing policy and start prodding them a bit more firmly to engage a bit more closely with us about that. But partly my concern there is about maintaining relationships. I think we're much better off trying to gently influence people to want to use these tools rather than force them to use these tools. And from that perspective, my priority at the moment, particularly for the toolkit, is improving all the time at being able to demonstrate to colleagues across government the direct benefit to them and their work of engaging with products like the toolkit as early as possible, so that they can see that the more that they engage with that, the better their policy is going to be really directly. And that will hopefully improve our take-up. But we're obviously much stronger on the monitoring side of things than the evaluation side. And I am very keen to understand more about the impact, not just for the toolkit, but also for my ICIA colleagues. I want to know both about the impact that they feel that having the ICIA has for communities, but how communities see it as well. So I think there's a lot more work that we could be doing on the monitoring and evaluation side that will maybe have to be a job for next year. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think that your story is very inspiring. I see that probably you are in a privileged position to assess, well, to what extent ICIA and the toolkit for rural delivery plan are, let's say, interacting, or at least there's learning from one experience to the other. But at the same time, I see a very realistic approach in your comments as well. So I think we have many things to learn. But I don't know if you have any questions that you would like to ask to Kate, or comments or ideas that come to your mind.
I have one question.
Please.
Hello. I'm interested in a specific aspects of cultural impact and language group, and how you manage this cultural diversity in Scotland. And for example, in Estonia, we have in South Estonia different language groups, and we would like to design also some different approaches for these different rural areas.
Please activate your micro.
Sorry. You'd think I'd have learnt by now. Okay, so yes, in Scotland, we have Gaelic speakers, and providing, so from a kind of process side of things, if we create like planning applications, or I think things like ICIAs have to be translated into Gaelic, I think, although I might double check that actually, because don't hold me to it. But basically, there is times when legally we are required to take into account different language groups and different language uses. But I'm not sure how that might interact with the ICIA at all. Is your interest particularly in communities being able to access what the government is doing?
Both. First is that my professor said that the cultural impact assessment is absent in my academic papers, and and how to measure the cultural diversity and cultural capital, for example, in different regions, and how the culture and language works for communities. And the other thing is, of course, this accession to the services and accession to the policy design processes and so on.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting. I suppose certainly in Scotland, I can't think of any communities that wouldn't have. I mean, many communities speak a lot of Gaelic very fluently, but I can't think of any where they would speak Gaelic more than they would speak English. So I don't think there's issues for us around accessibility, but there are certainly cultural elements where it's not based around language, but I think culturally there is often a sense in Scottish Islands where they do feel that there is a kind of very, very specific culture that is not recognised in a lot of Scottish government policy making. And I think partly the ICIA is supposed to address elements of that. That's kind of part of the core of what it does. But that does, to some extent, leave mainland rural communities underserved, because in many cases there is similar kind of senses of a very different culture that is not being picked up by the centralised government that we have. But whereas those living on islands might have that done through the ICIA, the mainland communities would not necessarily have it done through the toolkit because policy teams don't have to. So I think we're not doing too badly in the sense of it's not causing a problem with accessibility, but I still don't think that we recognise the differences in culture and an approach as well as we should.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
May I raise one question?
Please.
Yes, I'm particularly interested in the rural assessment toolkit. You said that this the guidance and the questionnaire are available to everyone who want to apply. This is very interesting, and I'm interested to know who use the rural assessment toolkit, if it's used also at the local level by local authorities, because this could be interesting. And what do you think about the potentiality of using this instrument at the local level?
That is a really good question. Mostly when we were thinking about, it's an internal tool that we're not publishing, so do we make it available to groups like this one or do we not? I was thinking about it mostly in terms of this is something that people might have an academic interest in, so we're happy to provide it. I didn't really think through whether people would want to be using it as a toolkit, but you're right, there are local authorities who might be interested in using the toolkit as a kind of functioning opportunity for them. Obviously, there's no way for me to know at the moment whether it's actually being used in that way, partly because it's so new, and partly because I wouldn't be able to kind of track that, because I could hand out the toolkit to somebody and then I'd have no idea what happens to it after that, because no one has a requirement to publish. They might take it away and they might use it proactively, but not tell my team about it. So I suppose from that perspective, yes, there is an opportunity for it to be used, but hidden from us, which is a gap. Mostly I was thinking about it in terms of lobbying that we get. So I have a stakeholder group called Scottish Land and Estates, and they have a particular interest in large estates in Scotland. And every year, I think they publish a sort of series of asks to government about things that they want to see happen that would improve the rural experience. And a couple of years ago, one of the primary ones was better rural proofing in government. So we're providing it almost as a sort of indicator of what's happening within government, but it's never been intended as a tool to be used outside. I don't know how effective it would be, given that it was written for policy teams. I don't know how effective it would be for external bodies to use, but it's certainly something that if there was shown to be interest, we could try and look at how we might adapt it, for example.
Mhm. Okay. Can we access to these documents?
Yes, so I sent a copy of it to Miguel, and I don't know if he's circulated it yet, but yes, we can definitely send copies.
Probably forgot. I apologize, but I will ask Anna to put all these documents on the website that we designed. And in any case, I commit myself to resend the whole set of documents again to you, probably in 2 times, because it's very low. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
It's my guilt. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
There are some of them that are very interesting. I find, I mean, I know role proofing is will always be an extra burden for workers in public administration, for decision makers. But the document entitled "Island Proofing Your Work," I find it's brilliant. I mean, and that makes things so easy to understand and just to get and know very quickly, very clearly what you are supposed to do and how that and it's so synthetic. It's, to me, it's perfect. It's a wonderful tool that everyone interested in embedding in the public administration that kind of assessment should be very much aware of and try to apply if possible. Well, do you have any more questions? I would like to remember to you that you also have the mural canvas if you want to use it to express your comments, views, and give your opinion on strengths and weaknesses.
I have a question, Miguel, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks, Kate. That was a really useful presentation. I suppose they're not really questions, I guess, just comments. One of which is around the sort of taking account of diversity of islands and rural, and how tricky that is to do with one tool. And yeah, I mean, how do you take account of even thinking just rural and not islands as well? The differences between remote mainland rural and accessible rural right next to me here, on the outskirts of Edinburgh. That's just really tricky. I think one thing that's always interested me about the ICIA process is this deciding whether there is likely to be a significantly different impact either between islands or between islands and rural. And how do you define or how does anyone define what a significantly different impact is? Is it, because of a number of people who will be affected, or, how do you do that, and who decides? And yeah, it just seems a bit vague and open to interpretation, let's say. And then my final comment was, I suppose I didn't know that you could request a review of a decision regarding.
Should I?
No, because that's really interesting. I didn't know that. And I was thinking about, the capacity within an island community to do that. If they decide that actually a full ICIA should have happened and it didn't, do they have the capacity to mobilize and say that? Some islands probably would, others probably not so much. But there are other bodies potentially who could suggest a review. So researchers, for example. But yeah, maybe you shouldn't have said that.
My colleagues won't thank me for that one. I do think you've put your finger on the button of that one, with your earlier comments, particularly where you were talking about, well, how do you define kind of like where the differences are? Because one of the things that we're saying to people is, you have to look at the rural context, and you have to engage with stakeholders, and then you have to work out where there's a difference between two communities, which is all well and good. But as you say, there's, islands which I don't think we can in practice separate out from remote rural communities. I think a lot of the time then it's a kind of, for my purposes, a political split but from a research that they're very similar to each other. So in practice, probably the same things would apply to remote, rural, mainland communities as islands. But the differences in terms of the impact of a particular policy on a remote rural community and an accessible small town, which technically still falls within our kind of overall rural picture, is huge. It's absolutely vast. And so it feeds back to that point I made about how much energy and resource and capacity are our colleagues going to put into this? Because if they had loads of time and energy and money, they could probably do an absolutely amazing job of sectioning out different types of communities and how the impacts would change depending on where they were and who they were talking to, and so have a very create a policy that is extremely flexible and place-based in application. And that is the gold star of what we want to have. But as I alluded to, most of my colleagues aren't going to be able to do that. And so then we end up with this, we're creating a homogenous picture of rural where we say, well, the differences will be a bit like this. And again, it's when you then translate that into, so how does that affect your policy development? We're talking very broad brush strokes, and that's where the impact is going to start, or the lack of impact is going to start worrying me. So there is a lot of work to be done around there. And I think because it's such a big job, a lot of that has to fall on our shoulders, not on the shoulders of the people completing the toolkit or the ICIA, because they're not going to be able to do that. So that, I think, is possibly the next iteration of both of our products, is how do we do that more effectively and help people so that we get more of that kind of flexibility and more of that nuance in creating these tools. But right now, I must admit, I don't think we're very good for that. Yeah.
Any more questions or comments? I would like to highlight something that drew my attention. It's that, well, you have the template, you have all the set of steps to take for a good assessment and so on. And then, it seems to me that I've read that it comes out of the Northern Irish experience, is that I found it in the document of the guidelines and templates, Annex C, annual reporting return template, where you can find for the ICIAs. So you have a series of questions describing how the organization has had regard to island communities in carrying out its functions, and provide a list of policies in which the organization has completed one of the section assessments defined. And the other steps, there's a series of questions. It's not long, it's just 3 questions, but I find that very relevant with a view to what could be evaluation in the future. I don't know if you find it to be too short, you could expand, or maybe it's far too much of what you can afford as for today.
I'm not familiar enough with that, because the ICIA is the other team that works on it. I get the impression that they slightly struggle with the sheer volume that they're getting back from people in terms of, everyone's filling in their templates and things, but they've got so much information coming back to them. How do they sift that? So I don't know whether they currently think that template is it giving them enough information to do anything meaningful with it? But if they do get more information to do meaningful things with it, do they have the capacity themselves to actually collate that and do any analysis on it? Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Ari, I think you have your hand raised.
Yeah. I'm interested also in the interaction between different departments, ministries in Scotland, and also interaction between ministry and parliamentary committee of Scotland. How this political communication and is going in this field.
For this, I can only speak to the kind of ministerial engagement around the toolkit rather than the ICIA. I do know that the ICIA have ministerial meetings in which there is a lot of coordination that happens, but I haven't been involved with it. With the toolkit, however, because it's connected to the Rural Delivery Plan, the Rural Delivery Plan has a ministerial working group where the ministers of all of the different policy areas that are involved in it come together, usually on a sort of quarterly or biannual basis, to talk about what's in it. So there's 18 different ministers that go to that. It's a really, really big meeting, and it's an opportunity for them to start thinking about kind of rural aspects that cross all different areas of policy. So there is a lot of there's a lot of discussion there and a lot of opportunity there. Whether or not that then translates into kind of more innovative, better ways of working together in the rural space, I'm not sure. I suspect that while we can definitely point people towards there's a lot of communication and we're sharing information and everybody knows about this, there is a secondary step that I would like to see happen where that translates into more action.
All right, thank you. Any more questions or comments? Well, all right. So thank you again, Kate, for your presentation. We'll take good note of it. Please write whatever you may find meaningful, useful, interesting on our mural canvas. Well, we organized it in two, let's say, separate ways, very roughly: weaknesses and strengths, and any questions that you may want to introduce there. And if you move the canvas a little bit to your right, you will find the same thing for the Canadian case, which is the one we're not going to deal with. I don't know whom you will make the presentation. Professor Dr. Heather Hall. Again, thank you, and please take the floor.
Perfect. Thanks, Heather. It's just fine. And Danica and I are going to share parts of the presentation this morning. We put together some slides just to provide some visuals because we are going to cover a bit of time, but also a few different examples from across Canada. So as Miguel mentioned, my name is Heather. I'm an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, which is in Ontario, Canada. And presenting with me is Danica.
Hi, everyone. My name's Danica. I'm a recent graduate of the Masters of Science program from the University of Guelph in Rural Planning and Development. And I'm also a board director for the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. And I work in rural policy in BC, in the BC government.
Perfect. So this morning we're going to cover a little bit of insights and lessons, and I think they really build well on what we just heard about the Scottish case study, particularly in terms of some of the challenges. And certainly in Canada, there's been, I think, a similar history where when there isn't legislative support for some of these tools, they become sometimes more of a suggested practice rather than something that is used cohesively across government. So we'll provide a few insights on our federal approach, and then we'll also look at some examples from our provincial, but also our regional and local levels, and then share some information on some of our civil society and rural advocacy groups, which I think really play an important role in that monitoring and evaluation when there isn't those formal mechanisms to do so, because it's often those advocacy groups that are pushing governments to implement these kinds of ideas, but also monitoring them on the ground to see whether or not they are working. So we thought we'd share a little bit of insights on some of the groups that Danica and I both have done some work with and are familiar with in Canada. So we wanted to start with what happened from the time period between 1996 and 2013. And one of the reasons we wanted to start here is this was a time where we had one of Canada's most internationally recognized approaches to rural development. And arguably, I would say it was also one of our most robust rural proofing time periods in the country, in terms of having a framework that included a rural lens. So we thought it'd be useful to just focus in on this time period and some of the initiatives that were developed. And then we'll pick up with what's been happening over the last several years. And I do want to make a quick point that we are currently in a federal election period. So things might look very, very different by the time we get to Spain next month. Our election is on April 28th. So there will be a new government, new leader coming in. And that could mean some changes in terms of how we approach rural proofing here in Canada. So one of the, I think, flagships during this time was the creation of what was called the Federal Rural Secretariat, and it was created in 1996. It was really designed to bring together various government departments around rural issues and priorities to promote dialogue with rural Canadians and the federal government. It evolved during a time when many rural communities were facing economic challenges. And so at this time, we had the collapse of our cod fishery in Atlantic Canada, but there was also restructuring happening in a lot of our resource industries that are often found within rural communities. And politically at that time, the governing federal party had little visibility in rural Canada. So they didn't really have a strong rural base. So it was seen as a way to help kind of show that the government was there and willing to listen and do something for rural. It was housed within the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, which in the Canadian context is considered a sectoral line department. Despite this, it was supposed to have the Rural Secretariat, this broad mandate to focus on all sectors of the economy that were important to rural Canada. To support the initiatives of this Rural Secretariat, the government created what was called the Canadian Rural Partnership. And it was part of a line item in the federal budget to really provide and empower the Rural Secretariat with a mandate and funding to support its activities. In 1999, the Prime Minister also appointed a Secretary of State for Rural Development to assist the Rural Secretariat with its mandate, and also created an interdepartmental working group on rural to try and get that horizontal coordination across government and really bring that unity across all of the government departments when it came to rural issues. And our Rural Secretariat operated until 2013, when the governing political party at that time did not renew its mandate. Some of the initiatives that were introduced over the lifetime of the Rural Secretariat included the Rural Lens, which we'll talk a little bit more about. There was also a rural dialogue process, which was carried out across the country to hear directly from rural Canadians on issues that were important to them. There was a pilot projects initiative, which funded creative approaches to community development in rural and remote Canada. And those projects had to be focused on some of the rural priorities that were identified in the federal framework for rural action. There was also a partnership with Statistics Canada, our main statistical agency in Canada, to create a Rural and Small Town Canada analysis bulletin, which would create timely and critical data on rural issues, trends, opportunities, and challenges to really support that evidence-based decision-making. There was a follow-up from the pilot projects called the Models for Rural Development Initiative, which was to test and evaluate various approaches to rural development issues. And then finally, the creation of the National Rural Research Network, which was a network designed to bring together policy and research practitioners from across Canada in partnership with the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. So all of these initiatives were seen as part of that more broader approach to how can we develop a rural development framework that's evidence-based and responds to the needs on the ground that rural communities were experiencing. In terms of our rural lens, it was created in 1998, and it was a tool for federal policymakers to be able to create policies and programs from the perspectives of people living in rural and remote regions. It was designed to be applied early from the onset, ideally, of the development of a program or policy by all federal departments. And the Rural Secretariat was there, particularly in the early days, as a resource to assist other departments within government in implementing that rural lens. But it is worth noting that there was no legislation that required other departments to apply it, and no penalties if the rural lens was not applied. So one of the tools, I guess, that the Rural Secretariat created when it was first released was this checklist of rural considerations. So I think it's kind of similar to what Kate was talking about in terms of some of the toolkits provided in Scotland when doing some of the rural assessments. And the initial toolkit had the following questions. How is this initiative relevant to rural and remote Canada? Is the impact specific to a selected rural, remote environment or region? So that gets into some of that place-based consideration. Is it specific to one particular region in the country, which is important in a place like Canada, where we have such a vast geography that we are working with in our constitutional governance system? How have the most likely positive and negative effects on rural Canadians been identified, and where relevant addressed? Is the initiative designed to respond to the priorities identified by rural Canada? So going back to some of those dialogues that have been had. Have rural Canadians been consulted during the development or modification of the initiative? And how is the benefit to rural Canadians maximized? And so these were some of the initial checklist considerations that departments could look at when they were starting to create their policies, programs, or other initiatives. Later, so a few years later, the Rural Secretariat came out with a document, so in 2001, called A Guide to Using the Rural Lens. And we can share all of these questions and documents as well, and our slides, so if anyone is interested in seeing what these were. But the guide was really there to help support the adoption of the rural lens, and it included 10 stages, including, I think among the first was understanding the rural context, so doing an environmental scan and impact assessment, identifying any people and organizations that needed to be involved or required consultation, and also identifying mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation. We're not going to go into them in too much detail, but again, we can share what exactly each of those 10 stages were and the questions that fit within each of those stages. So in terms of looking at how the rural lens was applied during that time, the Rural Secretariat ended up creating what was called a rural lens unit. And so this was initially started out with just one employee to work across the entire federal government. It grew to its maximum of about 8 employees. So still, I think in the grand scheme of things, when you're trying to work across government and implement something like a rural lens, definitely did not have the resources and the capacity to support. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when trying to create these kinds of approaches within government. But they did do a lot of work. And so I think the Rural Lens Unit was really there to review draft policies and programs. They would submit a report to the sponsoring government department on how their policy or program could be improved to better reflect rural remote realities. And it is worth noting that whoever was sponsoring that particular program or initiative had no responsibility to report back to the Rural Lens Unit on how they actually implemented any of the feedback. So I think that was another challenge with the approach during this time. And what we ended up seeing was that often the rural lens would get applied after something had been already developed and they were seeking approval from cabinet, versus early in the process to kind of help shape that design or delivery of a program or policy. Some of its successes were that we did see some policies and funding and other initiatives that were really responding to needs on the ground. So one was dedicated funding for rural infrastructure, the establishment of a rural health office in the Department of Health. Access to the federal government was also improved through increased Service Canada locations across the country. So they were broadened out to more rural locations in response to concerns about access to government that was heard in some of the dialogues. The Community Futures program also received additional investments. and community future development corporations expanded to include additional rural communities. And one of the ones that often gets talked about, and we're going back quite a number of years, but still a really important issue for rural communities in Canada, was that the Rural Lens and the Rural Secretariat were really seen as instrumental in facilitating the creation of Industry Canada's Broadband for Rural and Northern Development pilot program. So some of those initial introductions of broadband and addressing some of those shortcomings in rural Canada. With regards to some of the challenges, the first major one that we often talk about with regards to the Rural Secretariat was the location of it. It was located in a sectoral line department focused on agriculture. And this meant rural was then often seen as synonymous with the agricultural sector. And so it was hard to sometimes step back and really talk about other sectors or other issues that were important to rural communities. Second, it was a unit within a line department. It had no authority whatsoever to be able to force any kind of horizontal coordination or use of the Rural Lens despite its mandate. So it relied on a very active Secretary of State or minister to really use moral persuasion behind the scenes, and other departments to really want to embody and use the Rural Lens. Third, the Rural Secretariat and Rural Lens had an extremely small number of employees, as I mentioned, and really limited financial resources to carry out its work. And finally, much of the success of the Rural Lens unit and the Rural Secretariat occurred behind the scenes. There was no official reporting mechanisms in place to track success. So going back to that monitoring and evaluation, there was no robust framework for doing so. And so oftentimes those successes might get published in an annual report, or maybe connected in kind of an article about some of the funding announcements, but otherwise those successes were really being seen behind the scenes versus publicly. Just any questions up to that point? Okay. So in terms of what we're seeing now, so again, the Rural Secretariat, the Rural Lens, all were not renewed in 2013. And basically that led to its demise. So our Rural Lens was no longer used, but we have seen a bit of a shift over the last several years. So what our current approach to rural proofing at the federal level is we do have a Minister for Rural Economic Development. We have a Center for Rural Economic Development. There is also what's called the GBA Plus Intersectional Lens. There is a Rural Canada Statistics Portal again. And then over the last couple of years, there's been a federal, territorial, provincial meeting on rural economic development. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of these that we feel are important to the conversation today. So the Center for Rural Economic Development, it was created in 2019, and it's described as the federal focal point for all things rural. It's currently housed within, again, another kind of sectoral line department called Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. And from 2019 to just last month, so in March, it did have a dedicated Minister of Rural Economic Development. Since March, Rural Economic Development is now a shared file with the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. So the Minister of Rural Economic Development isn't actually in the same unit as the Center for Rural Economic Development, which you can imagine creates some interesting dynamics, but also then allows some of that cross-department coordination. In 2019, the government released a rural economic development strategy outlining a whole of government approach focused on 3 themes: places, people, and partnerships. And while it is a strategy, when you do look at the document, and it is available online, it does look a lot like an overview of where federal spending priorities will be directed when it comes to some of the important infrastructure and other concerns facing rural communities. Up until recently, the Center for Rural Economic Development also had a number of rural advisors across the country, and they were people who were on the ground in rural communities, helping to work with other organizations and provide that kind of point to rural communities, to the federal government. But they've quietly ended this program, and there are no rural advisors currently across the country. I'm going to turn things over to Danica now, who's going to provide a little bit of an overview of our GBA Plus.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks for doing the bulk of the presentation. So as Heather mentioned, there's this thing called Gender-Based Analysis Plus, GBA Plus, which is used in the federal government and also in some provincial governments as well. So I'm in British Columbia, and we use this tool in our work. And so the new kind of framing is this intersectional lens, and I call these all these little lollipop sticks or popsicle sticks. And so if you see in the pink one, there is geography. And so this kind of includes rural. So there's this aspect of this intersectional analysis that touches on rural as well as gender and age and disability and race and all of these things. So Ari's question about culture and language is kind of also reflected in this tool. And this is required in certain cabinet and treasury board submissions. I can speak a little bit more to the BC context, which unlike the very extensive or impact assessment forms, it's just to provide a summary. And so it's just one open-ended question of provide a summary on the analysis that you did. So that's in BC. And then in the federal context, they do have a more in-depth form where you check off, does it impact people with accessibility needs, people in rural areas, people who are low income, and you have to select all of it. With that in mind, it means that the tool is very vast and requires thinking about a lot of different intersection identity factors and cultural differences across the country. They do provide a variety of training resources, both at the federal and provincial level. And so there are videos and case studies, different scenario-based modules, that kind of thing, to try to help people conduct this GBA Plus analysis. And then in the federal context, there are these focal teams in different ministries that provide the support, kind of similar to what was being talked about in Scotland, where they're the leads for the gender-based analysis work within their division. In BC, we don't have that, but we do have community of practices. So it's a monthly meeting of people across government who are interested in advancing this kind of work. And they'll have webinars and guest speakers and maybe focus on a different topic each time. And there's also working groups. So for example, in the econ sector or in the social services sector, there will be people coming together to talk about how they're working on GBA Plus analysis in their work, if they have good examples, if they have specific training to their sector, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of what's existing right now, and rural is a part of it, but rural is a part of one of many different things. Certain areas on this analysis have also received more attention and received their own kind of training and resources. So in both the federal and provincial governments, there's a lot of work being done around reconciliation with Indigenous nations. And so there's, the Declaration Act, UNDRIP, and there's different specific training resources for that, which there's also a lot of crossover between Indigenous communities and rural communities. So the conversation about Scotland with the crossover between islands and rural is very much the same here, where we're looking at, okay, Indigenous communities and rural communities, and there's a lot of overlap. But how we address kind of rural proofing or reconciliation is really different in both places sometimes. And then, there's also been a lot of work on increasing accessibility, and so there's specific training towards that. Whereas, as Heather said, with the demise of the Rural Secretariat and the Rural Lens, right now there's a big gap in both the federal and provincial context of having rural specific training resources and supports to help people understand how geography fits in this massive intersectional analysis tool. So that's kind of my recap on GBA+. Heather, did I cover everything?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
and so we have just a couple of provincial and regional examples to share, and we won't spend too much time here, but just to highlight, I think Newfoundland and Labrador is one of the only provincial and territorial governments with a publicly available rural lens at this point in time. There are some other provincial governments that at times will have rural lenses, but they're not as public or publicly shared. So this one is one that's available. We can provide the link, and there is guidance. Again, it's not a requirement within the provincial government there, but it's provided as guidance for people within government who are developing programs or other initiatives to consider rural. And so similarly, there's a series of questions and then a guidance document that kind of helps people walk through how to include rural and assess impacts on rural. I'll turn things back over to Danica for some of the more local and regional initiatives, and ending with our kind of advocacy groups.
Perfect. So Huron County is a regional government in Ontario, and so considering how vast and large Canada is, we've got the federal government, provincial, state governments, and then also regional governments. And so Huron County created a healthy rural policy lens in 2014. That's when they started the work, and then it was actually published a few years later. And the big thing about their lens was to look at communities as a holistic whole. And so they've got this wheel here with different things like agriculture, economy, community. And so it's really small, but I'll send the link as well, and you can see all the different things. And basically what people would do is put whether or not it's a negative, neutral, or positive impact on each of those aspects of the community. And so then it was kind of like this little spider web analysis. And so it's presented visually to provide focused considerations. And the tool provides questions as well to help consider the factors such as time, money, and long-term impact in order to assess if the program or policy would have, this positive, neutral, or negative impact. And basically the guide, or this policy, was reviewed by the Rural Ontario Institute, which is a provincial-based organization, to see how it was working. So like this is where the monitoring and evaluation part comes in. They came in and they were like, hey, let's see how well it's working. And they found that it was relatively simple, and that Huron County residents really appreciated it and liked it. They had a strong understanding. So at least it was like people on the ground could look at it and go, yes, okay, I see what they're doing and how they're trying to accomplish this. However, like the other lenses mentioned, this tool is simple, but it still required a willingness to use it. So it wasn't mandatory and it wasn't required. However, they found that not just the county was using it, but also a lot of different groups, such as the University of Waterloo's School of Pharmacy, the Libro Credit Union, the Municipality of Grey, Ontario Parks and Recreation, and Avon Maitland District School Board's Gifted Students Program. So like there was a bunch of different groups that were using it and finding that it was helpful for them. However, in the Rural Ontario Institute's assessment of the program, they found that what they really needed to do was promote it even further. And so they did shift gears from assessing the effectiveness of the lens towards providing ongoing advocacy and promotion of the tool so that it would have broader uptake. And that's kind of where that went. And so they said, like, the key findings were really that the need for ongoing staff advocacy of the tool is abundantly clear. So common theme there. We need staff resources to make sure these things actually continue. In terms of other forms of advocacy, we have a variety of different rural-focused groups across the country. And so we've mentioned already the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, which I'm a board member of. Heather has been in the past and is still, of course, a very active committee member. This group is very academic, provides like an annual conference, helps promote new research, and has partnered with the federal government on a variety of initiatives. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities Rural Caucus is like an association of local government that comes together, and so the Rural Caucus often advocates to the federal government on rural issues. The Rural Development Network is based in Alberta, but is growing their scope to have a more national outlook. They are more practitioner-based, and so they provide resources and training towards people who are on the ground doing rural development work. So quite different than the SURF organization in terms of who their target audience is. And then there's a variety of different provincial organizations. So I mentioned the Rural Ontario Institute, and then there's the BC Rural Centre, so very like kind of economic development focused rural advocacy groups. And then ROMA is like a smaller version of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It's the Rural Ontario Municipal Association. So they have their own group in Ontario for local government to advocate to the provincial government, which is not seen in most other provinces. So those are kind of the different players. And then in terms of attempting to create that clear statement of strong and real political will and commitment, CERF, the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, just released an election questionnaire because we're in the middle of a federal election. And it's calling on the federal government or the federal parties who are running for office to commit to revitalizing the rural lens and strengthening CEDRED, which is, as Heather mentioned, like the Rural Advisor Program has kind of quietly gone away. And so, bringing that back and making sure it has the financial support to continue. And so we're asking political parties to provide their answers in a couple of weeks, and then we're going to release them to the public so that people can be really thinking about rural issues as they go to the polls. And so I'll throw the link as well to our questionnaire. And then Heather and Dr. Sarah Breen have done a fantastic conversations piece, which is a little bit more hard-hitting because SURF tends to be quite apolitical. And so there's, kind of like a myriad of different advocacy approaches going on to complement each other and try to make rural a talking point during this election. So, yeah.
Wow, impressive. Thank you very much, Danica and Heather. Well, it looks like the rural lens has outlived the rural secretariat in Canada. And in some way, I don't know if, even though it developed behind the scenes, as you mentioned, it has had obviously an impact beyond these curtains, because otherwise I wouldn't understand what you have explained to us today. I tried to dive a little bit into the the working methods of the old secretariat and what's going on, and I couldn't find anything. It seems everything is in the governmental archives, and I couldn't get into. I got lost. I tried to make search either in French or in English, and I failed miserably. So I would appreciate very much if you could provide us with all the documents that you may deem relevant for our understanding of what has been going on and is going on now. And that's it. Betty Ann has one question or one comment to make, so please take the floor.
Hello, and sorry I missed the Scotland presentation, but I'm glad I caught Canada. I had a question. to work on our paper on rural proofing. I think, Heather, you and I may have spoken, I don't know, might have been a year ago now, I'm not sure. But you'll find this funny. A lot of our work is approved by governments, as you know. And I think I had put in my paper that something about the rural lens. I quoted the paper that you sent me, and I referenced that rural proofing didn't exist anymore, maybe at the federal level, but maybe found its way into the area you mentioned. Long story short, I got a 9-page reply from the Canadian federal government on where rural proofing still what existed. So, and while you were presenting, I searched my email furiously to see if what you were saying, but they disagreed and felt that rural proofing was still very present and active at the federal level. In the innovation, I'm gonna forget the rest of the name, but
I said
the language,
yeah.
The language that appears in the paper says it's in rural lenses no longer exists, but the Ministry of Innovation is continuing it. And I did have some interviews with them, and they did talk about how they're doing it. So I guess my comment or question is more where the perception of rural proofing. I feel like that the perception of what is rural proofing and how it should be seems to differ depending on who the party is, even within the country. So there are parts who will say there's no rural proofing. And then it was interesting to have a department tell me that that's what we do. Do you see what I mean? And so my takeaway is more, and then as you leave the federal and go into local and so on, it differs. So how do you then do rural proofing when the perception of it is so varied? And then by definition, the expectation of how it could be successful will vary, because it seems like a moving target. I mean, and Canada is a big country. So, I mean, I don't know how, but that was my takeaway from the different folks I spoke to on the Canada model.
Yeah, and I think it's important to define what rural proofing is. So certainly since 2019, the government has had a renewed kind of federal rural development approach through CNRED. So that can be considered rural proofing, having that place-based center that is focused. What really hadn't been revitalized in the same way was that rural lens as a tool. Now, as Danica mentioned, it is part of that GBA plus intersectional analysis. So when we talk about there really isn't a rural lens, we're thinking about the rural lens as a standalone rural lens that existed under the Rural Secretariat. If we were to ask the federal government, is there a rural lens? They would likely say, yes, it's part of GBA plus. So again, it's that kind of difference in terms of what we're identifying or what we're defining as part of that rural proofing. And so I agree that there does exist rural proofing mechanisms within the federal government, some of which have been, I think, weakened over the last year in particular. But there is still a Center for Rural Economic Development that is providing that kind of cross-government coordination. It is there to provide rural guidance to policymakers and anybody creating new programs or initiatives on how to make sure rural is included. And it does factor into that GBA plus, but it is one of many lenses that factor into that intersectional analysis. And I think you're exactly right. When there are so many differences, I think we've got the federal level, but then we've also got provincial and territorial, and then we have local and regional. You do start to see differences, and I think that's where some of the more coordinated efforts, particularly the last 2 years, bringing together ministers for rural at the provincial, territorial, and federal levels to really talk about more coordinated approaches is really important to have those kinds of avenues. So that was something, I think the first one was in 2023, I want to say. So somewhat more recent. But yeah, I would definitely say it's hard to identify a unifying approach just in terms of the way our government system is structured, and kind of the constitutional authority that's ascribed to various government levels.
If I may just, sorry, but just a quick follow-up on that. The other thing that struck me is when I was doing the paper at the time, and this came out of all the interviews, I talked a lot about rule proof and intelligence. And what I also find interesting about your presentation is the fact that the evidence to support rule proofing is scattered. It's in different parts of Canada. So how, as you were thinking about this, how is there a coordination gap on the evidence? Because the one thing is rule proofing, but if you say this initiative or this strategy or this area needs X, it's not enough to say you need the evidence. Now I noticed that you have state of the rural evidence because I just used it in another report. But this idea of not just that, but how do you get is the evidence in one place? Or is there any work on that part? Because it's not just rule proofing, it's also the evidence for.
Yeah, and I think that's one of, oh, go ahead, Danica, if you want to tackle.
Well, yeah, Heather put like the federal government has like this rural Canada statistics portal. And so there is some data there, but it's limited to like a lot of just census data. And then again, like what you're saying about the scattered nature of the evidence is very apparent because different provincial governments or even nonprofit advocacy groups will have their own kind of data portals and available work. So like the Rural Ontario Institute has like a rural data dashboard. And then in BC, we have that at regional level. So like the Northern Development Trust has a data dashboard, which isn't necessarily rural based, but other than Prince George, the entire area is rural. So, but yeah, the data is very scattered and there's not, like the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation tries to provide some of that coordination, and we have like a committee that's been working on that. But it's definitely all over the place. Heather, do you want to add any comments to that?
Yeah, and I think so that's important on the data, and then on the monitoring and evaluation, which I think is connected, is a lot of these initiatives don't really have in those built-in mechanisms. So then it is hard to actually publicly monitor or evaluate them. And it often involves researchers having to do projects where we can kind of dig a little deeper, maybe through interviews or other ways, questionnaire surveys, to try to get a sense of what the landscape is and how some of these programs or initiatives have supported rural or maybe haven't had quite their intended purposes. And you mentioned State of Rural Canada. So that was something SURF started doing, I want to say in 2016, I think was the first one, 2018, can't remember now. But there's been 4 iterations, and we try to put out a State of Rural Canada every 2 years to give a sense of what the landscape looks like. Usually there's a particular theme, and try to pull together insights from across the country for each province and territory to kind of give that somewhat, I think, cohesive or higher level overview of what is happening for rural Canada across the country.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask if you could just take a little more time to take the questions and comments by Roland and Francesco. I think it's worth it after what we have heard today. So please, Roland, take the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I was actually going to ask something in a similar direction. So in terms of the gender-based assessment plus and the framing and headline thoughts, I would say. Because when we led several years ago some discussions with the European Commission on revising the better regulation guidelines, where there was quite an intense discussion on territorial impact assessments and rural proofing to be strengthened in there. We faced significant let's say, push from the Secretary General to not focus concretely on rural proofing as an independent element, but to include it within other kinds of assessments. First of all, because they felt that they didn't want to overburden the policy process, so they wanted to have a lower kind of number of tools in principle, but also to reduce kind of the, let's say, power of individual DGs, in this case, most likely DG Agri, to push for the application of additional tools. So simply, I wouldn't say hiding, but trying to fit it under a different headline, so it's not as visible as it could have been. And this didn't, I think it didn't really work, because now rural proofing is kind of a significant topic on the European level as well. But there was at least an attempt to do this. And my question then was going to be in the direction of the gender-based assessment plus, is the simple fact that the headline is different, something that hides the issues that need to be addressed. It's not only rural, but there are a lot of other topics that are fit now under one headline with an existing but limited connection, I would say. So does this diminish kind of the importance to an extent? Is this a problem for this reason?
Yeah, I would say that like you're spot on. Like when you're trying to look at 10 different factors, like they each get kind of watered down, and people end up focusing on one or the other. There is intersectional aspects that are still valuable to look at. So it is important for policy analysts to be looking at, okay, what about low income people in rural areas, or women, or particularly in Canada, rural areas are not very diverse. And so, how do you make sure that you're serving people of color in rural communities who are quite marginalized? And so there's value in having that intersectional conversation. But when it's just one of many things, it often doesn't get a lot of attention. And then some of the other elements of that GBA Plus do have their own resources and training, and even, like in BC, for instance, there's like an anti-racism data act, and there's a lot of initiatives around increasing accessibility and providing support for people with diverse needs. And so it's kind of like, how do you make sure that rural also has the supporting resources, training, whether that's a rural proofing toolkit, in order to make sure that it gets the attention that it needs and isn't just watered down as one of many things to consider, and to make sure that policy analysts know how to consider it, because they might be able to more easily think, okay, I can think about gender, or I can think about someone with support needs, but if they don't have any experience with rural communities, which is often the case in like our governments are fairly centralized, and so a lot of public servants work in the capitals or in the main metropolitan areas, and so making sure that they have that experience and knowledge of rural context is important, and they might not have it just based off of their own personal experience.
All right, thank you, Danica, again. And it's Francesco's turn, please.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I have two questions. One is on the method. Your rural lens is based essentially on a checklist of questions. And from your presentation, I noted that there is a change between the first and the second period in the list of questions. It seems that in the second period, the questions are more general than in the first one. My question is that true? And the other question is on the fact that you can assess in the process different kind of policies. So I'm interested to know if the checklist is applied indifferently to the different policies, or there is a checklist, a specific checklist depending on the type of policies, because this is quite important. Every policy is on specificities. Well, and the importance is on the answer to these questions. Are they qualitative or quantitative? The answers that are provided. This is.
I can start with kind of the previous model, so the rural lens that existed from 98 to 2013. So it was a checklist, but then there was also a few years after the checklist was created, there was a guidance document that provides the 10 stages. So it was much more comprehensive in terms of the, I think, guidance provided to other policymakers trying to create initiatives. In terms of those, how it was applied, it was designed to be applied to all newly conceived initiatives within government or any that were being changed. So it was designed to be applied at the onset of anything that was being created or being changed within government, whether that's a program, a policy, or other initiative. What ended up happening was often it was applied at the end when departments were going to cabinet for approval, and they might be asked, did you apply the rural lens? So then it was kind of going back and trying to tick those boxes. The questions themselves in the guidance could include both qualitative and quantitative, I think, in terms of the responses. Particularly around some of the impacts assessment and the environmental scan could have some quantitative aspect to it, I think, depending on what the program or policy being created was and how you were going to measure or talk about those impacts. I don't know if Danica maybe can speak a little bit more about the current one, but the GBA plus intersectional policy lens is a legislated, is my understanding at the federal level, it is a requirement to apply. And there are questions within that, again, that look at rural specifically. And so there's focal point teams within every department who are kind of looking at new initiatives and trying to see whether or not that intersectional lens has been applied, and then offering advice if there needs areas that need to be strengthened. So that's my understanding of how that works, but I'm certainly less familiar with the GBA plus intersectional lens and how that's applied within government right now. Danica, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I threw the template into the chat, and so that's the federal example, which is like a lot of checklist kind of like who does it impact, that kind of thing. And then at I can only speak to the BC example, which it's literally just provide a summary and that's it. And again, because it's so intersectional, people may or may not touch on the rural considerations at the provincial level. Like in the federal, they're going to have to either decide, am I checking rural or remote or am I not? But yeah, it's as much as it's required for cabinet submission, as Heather mentioned, because it's required at that late stage, people don't often do it in the beginning, which is what they're supposed to do. And the training is not required. And so there are pretty extensive training courses at both the federal and provincial level, but it's optional on whether or not you want to take the training. And so you might get to the end and go, oh, I need to provide this, report on GBA plus, which includes this little bit about rural, but you didn't do any of the training and you haven't started that in the beginning of your process. And so it means that the true objective of GBA plus, or the true objective of rural proofing, which is to start it in the beginning, it didn't happen. And so how you get that will and commitment within the public service to do it early has yet to be figured out, I think, in the Canadian content.
And I think that training within government is a really important part of rural proofing that I think is often missing from the conversation. We often talk about the political support, so the ministers and the elected officials who can help drive these changes. And we talk about the rural advocacy groups and civil society, but that training piece within government, particularly in places like Canada, but elsewhere where most of government is happening from larger places and kind of coming back out, having people who are trained in understanding why this is important, why we're actually doing it, I think is a really important missing piece of the puzzle. So trying to make this a mandatory training, how to apply kind of rural proofing or a rural lens in particular, I think would be something important to consider within government.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much again, Heather, Danica, of course, Kate, for your presentations. It looks like in Canada, the Rural Secretariat created some sort of rural intelligence or rural proofing intelligence that has outlived its very administrative existence, and it's seemingly coming back. But still, I think that there was also evaluation from the part of society, and that evaluation in one way or another concluded that the rural lens was useful, was positive, and should be worth a second or third opportunity, not only at regional level, but also at federal level. So good luck. Let's hope that after the election, things will go better in this way. And before saying goodbye to everybody, well, we'll initially have scheduled another case study session for the 14th of April, same time, I guess. Sorry, Danica. And we'll have a presentation by Castilla-La Mancha. I would like to get someone else making a presentation on any of the cases that could be interesting to analyze, and also from the perspective also on monitoring and evaluation. But anyway, if we can, we will do it. If not, it will be only Castilla-La Mancha. Anyway, for those who have missed a part of it, you know that we're going to upload the video to our website, and that's all. If you have any comments to add to our mural canvas, I will be very grateful, because it will help me as well to gather all the missing ideas that my brain couldn't process over this time. And well, we'll meet again. It's coming sooner, the date of the 10th of May, where we'll meet as many as we can in Cuenca. So enjoy your Easter holidays, and have nice days.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.